The United States owes roughly $36 trillion. China owes about $15 trillion. Japan owes $10 trillion. Germany owes $3 trillion. The UK owes $3 trillion, $5 trillion. Every major nation on Earth is in debt. Total global debt now stands at approximately $317 trillion, which is about 330% of global GDP. In other words, the entire world produces far less in a year than it owes. To pay it all off, humanity would need roughly 3 full years of global production with zero consumption. But here is the question almost no one asks. If everyone is in debt, who is the creditor? Debt is a zero-sum system. For every borrower, there must be a lender. If the world owes $317 trillion, then someone owns $317 trillion in financial claims. Who holds those claims? The answer reveals the largest wealth concentration mechanism in human history, not through conquest or theft, but through a system where the many borrow, the few lend, interest compounds indefinitely, and debt can never mathematically be repaid. Wealth flows upward while the process appears natural and unavoidable. To understand who holds the debt, you first have to understand what debt actually is in the modern system. Most people think debt works like personal borrowing. You borrow money the bank already has, then repay it with interest. That is not how modern government and banking debt works. When governments borrow money by issuing bonds, the money does not exist beforehand. The act of borrowing creates the money. A government issues bonds. Central banks and commercial banks buy them, but the money used to buy those bonds is created digitally through balance sheet entries. Central banks create money from nothing. Commercial banks do something similar through fractional reserve banking. If a government borrows $1 trillion, that $1 trillion is created in the process. Here is the critical part. Only the principal is created. The interest is not. If $1 trillion is borrowed at 5% interest, the borrower owes $1 trillion plus $50 billion per year. That $50 billion was never created. It must come from future borrowing or from taxing existing money. This creates a mathematical trap. Total debt always exceeds the money supply because interest is owed but never issued. The system therefore requires perpetual debt growth just to function. This is not a flaw, it is the design. So who holds the global debt? There are 4 main categories. First, central banks.
Central banks collectively hold around $25 trillion in government bonds. They create money to buy government debt and collect interest on it. While central banks are often presented as public institutions, their structures frequently benefit private banking systems. Interest ultimately flows through financial channels dominated by large banks and financial institutions. Second, institutional investors. Pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, and sovereign wealth funds hold roughly $120 trillion in debt. While pensions nominally belong to workers, control rests with fund managers. Insurance companies and asset managers are owned by shareholders, and share ownership is overwhelmingly concentrated among the wealthy. The top 10% of households own the vast majority of financial assets. Third, foreign governments. Governments hold about $30 trillion in other nations' debt. This is driven largely by global trade imbalances. Exporting nations accumulate foreign currency and recycle it into government bonds. The benefits flow to political and financial elites within those countries, not to average citizens. Fourth, wealthy individuals and family offices. The global top 1% holds tens of trillions in financial assets, much of it in bonds. The wealthiest families and individuals earn massive interest income simply by owning claims on debt. A portfolio earning 4% on $10 billion generates $400 million per year without producing anything. This is the core mechanism of wealth concentration. Borrowers work, lenders collect. Interest flows from taxpayers, workers, and households to asset holders. The wealthy reinvest interest into more assets, compounding their wealth. Borrowers remain trapped in repayment. This pattern is not new. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church was the dominant lender and became one of the largest landowners through debt foreclosures. Banking families like the Medici grew powerful by lending to monarchs. The Bank of England was created as a private institution to lend to the government and collect interest paid by taxpayers. The Rothschilds perfected international sovereign lending and became dominant creditors across Europe. J.P. Morgan used the same model. Across centuries, the pattern is identical. Those who lend accumulate wealth. Those who borrow become dependent. Modern debt functions the same way, just at a global scale. Today, global interest payments total roughly $15 trillion per year.
That is $15 trillion flowing upward annually from borrowers to creditors. Governments pay interest through taxes. Corporations pay interest through profits extracted from workers and consumers. Households pay interest through wages. The top 1% captures a disproportionate share of this interest income. The concentration accelerates because interest compounds. Debt must keep growing, because if new debt stops being created, there is not enough money to service existing interest. When debt growth outpaces economic growth, as it currently does, the system becomes unstable. Global debt is growing faster than global GDP. If current trends continue, debt will exceed 400% of global output within the next decade. At that level, interest payments alone consume an unsustainable share of total production. Something eventually breaks. Historically, there are only 3 outcomes: default, inflation, debt jubilees, or restructuring. Each outcome disproportionately harms the middle class while protecting elites who hold diversified assets, hard assets, and global positions. During crises, asset prices collapse and creditors buy at discounts. This happened during the Great Depression. It happened in 2008. It will happen again. The global debt system is not an accident. It is a wealth extraction mechanism that operates during both expansion and collapse. You cannot fully escape it. Interest is embedded in mortgages, rents, taxes, prices, and wages. Over a lifetime, the average person pays enormous sums in direct and indirect interest to people far wealthier than themselves. So if everyone is in debt, who is the creditor? The answer is a relatively small global elite operating through central banks, financial institutions, governments, and private wealth structures. Interest payments from billions of people to millions, and ultimately thousands, form the largest continuous wealth transfer in human history. That is what the $317 trillion debt really represents. The next question is not who the creditor is. The question is what happens when the system reaches its limit.